Whose double whammy was worse? Rishi Sunak suffered not one but two humiliating by-election defeats last week, and rumours abound that a poor showing at the May local elections will likely see a batch of no-confidence letters winging their way to the chairman of the 1922 committee, as anxious MPs conclude that giving us a fourth Prime Minister in as many years will not look like the lunatics have taken over the asylum. Meanwhile, Keir Starmer, basking in another couple of poll victories, still has challenges to deal with himself, most of which are wrapped up in the Middle East conflict. We'll be asking if Sunak will survive and how damaging the past fortnight has been for the leader of the opposition. We'll also be taking a look ahead to those local elections and, in particular, the mayoral contest in the West Midlands. Welcome to the latest episode, the Downtown Den Politics Podcast.
Just looks like a bigoted woman.
Me and my friends sort of used to run through the fields of wheat.
You turn if you want to. The ladies not for turning.
It will cost.
I know words, I have the best words, but there's no better word than stupid.
Okay, welcome to this week's Downtown Den Politics Podcast. Delighted to be joined as ever by Downtown's political commentator Jim Hancock, but also as a special treat for our listeners this week, we have Kevin Johnson. Kevin, a long-time friend of Downtown in Business down in Birmingham. Kevin is, political commentator himself. Managing director, I think, is the right term, Kevin, for Urban Comms. Tell us a little bit more about your background, sir, for those few people who don't know of you, who you are.
Well, why should they? Yes, I run a small strategic comms public affairs agency called Urban Communications based in Birmingham. I spent about 15 years in television, working for Central TV, including with responsibility for public affairs, where my paths crossed with one David Cameron. And since then, I've been involved in all kinds of things in and around the political scene and the wider communication scene in Birmingham and the West Midlands.
Lovely. And we'll start with you, Kevin, seeing as you're our special guest. And I just wanted to ask your reflections on those by-election results last week.
Well, I mean, great successes for Labour, but they were sort of in the bag, weren't they? So they came as no surprise. So I don't suppose there's any great dividend that comes from them, even though one of them recorded one of the greatest swings that Labour has ever received from the Tories in a by-election. And I think we're into 9 seats, having switched from Tory to Labour in this Parliament, one which went the other way, which was quite famous over the weekend. If anybody's reading the Sunday Times and Times articles from Tom Baldwin on Starmer. So they were great successes, but of course they were slightly shrouded in the earlier part of the week and the next by-election, which will feature 3 Labour candidates who are not Labour candidates.
Yeah, it is bizarre, the whole Rochdale situation, which I'm sure we'll come on to. But let me just stick with those by-election results, Kevin. And as you say, it was no surprise that Labour won both seats. The Conservatives hardly contested them by all accounts. Very few people campaigning on the ground. One of those seats, of course, won't even exist as a constituency come the next election in a few months' time. Both seats vacated by Tory MPs, one who resigned on the back of the government's lack of, as he saw it, lack of urgency in dealing with the climate crisis. The other, Peter Bone, and all sorts of allegations made against him. And then, bizarrely, the local association selected his partner to contest that seat. So both of those are expected to fall to Labour. But the interesting thing, I suppose, and the thing that's probably made many Tory MPs a bit frit, was the performance of Reform, because the Reform Party scored north of 10% in both seats, and that is bad news for the Tories.
It is, and that is all without one Nigel Farage, owner, president of Reform, but not actually being involved in Reform, not being its leader. Imagine what would happen if he were to be involved in the route to the election, which of course he is dangling in front of us and enjoying very much almost on a daily basis. So with that, I mean, the amazing thing is, of course, but probably like UKIP, and Jim and you may have better memories than me, they don't have anybody that you've heard of. I mean, Ben Habib probably most of us in and around politics have heard of because of his previous associations with Farage. But Reform has sort of gained to 13% in polls in some circumstances, with nobody other than Nigel Farage, president. Tice, some people have heard of. I think Widdicombe's involved, one or two of those sort of old names. But really, they're getting somewhere on the sort of electoral map.
I think we've lost Kevin's connection for the moment. We'll come back to him in a second. So, Jim, I think the point that Kevin was making there was that the Reform Party, without too much profile at this moment in time in reality, other than amongst us politicos and obviously those people within the Westminster bubble, are still performing relatively well, indeed outpolling the Liberal Democrats at the moment. So how concerned should the Tories be in terms of that Reform resurgence?
Well, they should be concerned, and of course Kevin was referring to UKIP in the past, and of course it's because of the rise of UKIP that the whole referendum on leaving the European Union was instituted. So we shouldn't underestimate the pull of the right, whether they actually get any MPs or not, or whether they actually in a general election where they are pledged to fight in all Great Britain's seats. And I think they'll be stretched to put up sort of incredible candidates in that number of seats. But it's the effect it's going to have on the Conservative Party. And, the One Nation Tories and Farage said at the weekend that they'd be better off just going off and joining the Liberal Democrats because that's what they are. So he was sort of presaging a breakup of the Tory party. I don't think we should overemphasize this, but it is this. I think it's immigration that's fueling this. The concerns about immigration, that's what's giving them their lift. A bit like North Sea oil gave Scottish nationalism a lift in the 1970s. An insurgent party needs an identifiable cause that people can understand without going into the details of it. Because you're quite right, people don't follow politics in the way in which we three do. So I think, it's the effect it's going to have on Sunak, his increasing desperation to get the Rwanda bill through, hoping that the economy improves. But it is a concern on that side. But of course, Farage drops these bombshells into the political debate, just like Trump does. And they are very similar in some ways in their technique. Trump sort of says, let Russia attack any country that underspends in Western Europe. And Farage threw out a line at the weekend, you ask most Conservatives and they'd rather have me as the leader. Yeah. So, it depends what their strategy is. But Tice, their actual leader at the moment, I was struck by his vehemence about not doing any deal with the Tories this time. You remember that Farage pulled all his troops in 2019, which helped to contribute to Johnson's big majority. Tice seems very, very vehement about not doing any sort of deal.
Yeah, and I think there's two reasons for that. I think that Tice recognises that actually the votes that Reform are getting are not entirely Tory disaffected supporters. Indeed, polls suggest that only a third of those people who voted Reform, those by-elections, for example, would switch to the Tories if Reform stood down. It's anyone but the Conservatives for many of those people who are voting Reform at this moment in time. So there's no positive bonus for Reform to stand down because it's not actually going to return a lot of Conservatives' votes to the Tory party. And I think the other thing that is rightly identified is that you can only pull that trick once. So if you're committed and you're saying to 600 odd people, we want you to fight these elections come the general election, to pull them again, I think would just be, as I say, a trick too far. But for me, the problem that Sunak has now is whether he tacks further to the right. And as many people have said, and you and I have said this previously, Jim, you're never going to be able to out-reform reform. And so that, no matter what Sunak does, he's never going to be able to go as far as Reform, wish him to go in terms of things like immigration, tax cuts and other issues as well. But then it is this spectre of Nigel Farage, isn't it? And Kevin, good to have you back. I'm sorry we lost your connection there. But we did follow your train of thought there, saying that, Reform had done particularly well, despite not necessarily having a great profile within the general populace. Nevertheless, wonder if I could get your take on what this means for Sunak, because it seems to me that although a minority within the Conservative Parliamentary Party are of that sort of right-wing ilk, he does pander to them on a regular basis, whilst ignoring the bulk of his parliamentary party, who, as Nigel Farage says, as Jim reminded us there over the weekend, ought to just go off and join the Liberal Democrats. Sunak's I think he's in a terrible position, Kevin. I think it is the old saying, isn't it? A rock and a hard place.
He is between a rock and a hard place. And, on any objective analysis, he needs what Labour have had a couple of times. He needs a good period in opposition. You can't really sort these things out when you're actively in government. When you got that 14 years of history, you got people who have been thrown out of ministerial office, people who don't like what's happened, etc., etc. You've got this whole five families thing going on. You talk about the parliamentary party. The problem of the Tory party, and not say Labour don't have similar issues, is their party in the country is broadly in a different place to where a lot of its parliamentary party are, or at least the kind of people that David Gauke's, the Rory Stewarts, that sort of the whole kind of Cameron Osborne revolution. The party is in the country is in a different position in terms of the sort of political sweet spot. And then he's got these sort of five families thing going on. And you've got different, you can say the Tories are bound together by independence about low tax, small state, etc., etc. But you've got some really big differences, both in terms of social policy and economic policy. Any objective analysis of the economy now would say you need investment in public services, a lot of reform too, but you need investment in public services and you need investment in infrastructure. And at the same time, the pressure on Sunak to lower taxes as a sort of an election tool is immense. There's nowhere to go, is there? And I think he hoped that just by being I think he is a decent, reasonable man, by being decent and reasonable, by being a sort of spreadsheet type guy of just sort of getting some things done, that would rescue the Tories' reputation for competence. But it's not working, is it? Because his party won't row in behind him in any great number to get these things done or to stop the noises off. Well, I'm sure we'll come on to it, but he won't take this advice. The best advice is to go to an election early.
Well, this is the ripping the plaster off and getting on with it scenario. But there may be something in that. Go on May the 2nd at the same time as the local elections. I don't know about that. Margaret Thatcher used to avoid that, actually. In 83 and 87, she always went a few weeks later. So people were sort of...
She was in a bit of a better position than Mr. Sunak is, though, James.
Yeah. If I may, Frank, I'm just interested in Kevin's view on this. When you look at Rees-Mogg and Tice and things, you're hard-pressed to pick out the political differences. And apart from the absolute thing that Frank and I have frequently discussed, the incredible cohesiveness of the Conservative Party since the 1840s, you do wonder whether there's a crossover there. I don't know whether you think that there would be talks going on.
Yeah, but it's the attachment to brand, isn't it? The brand loyalty, as well as being a brilliant election-winning machine into a large part. You can't really imagine a Rees-Mogg, given his sort of heritage and so on, you can't imagine him leaving, can you? And arguably, you can't marry the kind of the social reform type stuff of Cameron Osborne, and to a degree of Johnson, to be fair to him, because Johnson's in the same place socially, really. You can't really marry that, can you, with some of the more extreme, tack to the right type stuff. Rees-Mogg, it's stuff of the 18th century, isn't it, famously? I don't know how you can sort that, and you can't sort it in months, and you can't sort it in government. And you need a good clear out, don't you? You need to sort of start again. But it would appear probably some of the potential new MPs coming through, of course, the Tories going to lose way over 50 just by, people dropping out, MPs dropping out, probably 100 by the time the election comes, before the electorate's had made their decision on who stays and goes. You can only really sort that out, I think, in opposition. And I think that's just, I think personally, if you're just looking at it as dispassionate as you can, Sunak's main objective, beyond running a government well and running a country well, should be to leave the Tories in their best possible position in opposition, with the most number of MPs it can use in opposition, and then try and form an effective opposition. Starmer looks like he's turned around an 80-seat majority in 5 years. There's no reason why the Tories can't do the same in 5 years, but they'd be better off placed with more MPs left, which I think would happen in May, than it will in October or November.
And Jim, do you think that the talk of those letters once again of no confidence going in to challenge Sunak and giving us, as I say, our fourth Prime Minister in as many years, is that serious, do you think?
I think it's serious amongst a few people, but even those that, and a lot of them don't have any faith in Starmer at all, in Sunak at all, are aware of the pantomime nature of actually having a fourth leader in so many years. So I think they'll be reticent. I think, there probably are, I think it's only about 56 letters. We talk about the 80-seat majority, that's long gone. But I think there's probably enough people who would like to put a letter in, but whether they've actually done it or not, I'd be surprised. Because what usually happens with votes of confidence, and this happened with Theresa May and Boris Johnson, they both won votes of confidence. The party was sort of obviously torn apart by actually having the thing. They both actually won them, and then further crises happened and they went. As Kevin says, all this is playing out whilst we're talking about the governing party of this country. For all this to be playing out, for Sunak to get, which he probably would, get a vote of confidence, but there'd be a big vote against him. So it'd be the question about, is that really a vote of confidence? And the thing would just drag on. I think a lot of those who would like to see him gone, if they could make a swift change to somebody else, that's the other slight problem about who the somebody else is who's going to be the magic figure. There's an element of truth in crude political terms. If you could parachute Farage in, you need someone like that, and I don't think Badenoch or Penny Mordaunt, Suella Braverman, I don't think they would make that much difference. I think that people would say, for heaven's sake, give us the choice. Don't keep on manoeuvring at Westminster. Give us the choice. So I doubt there's probably enough people who would like to change the leader, but I think they will hold back from the pantomime and chaos that would result in them being successful.
There's two things, aren't there, Jim? There is the whole pantomime business. It just would look, if it isn't ridiculous enough already, it really would be ridiculous then. And secondly, who? There is nobody. It's not like you've got a Johnson waiting in the wings. It's not like you've got a Brown waiting in the wings in the Blair era. The obvious next person, so much so they don't even, in Brown's case, require a vote. That person doesn't exist. Penny Mordaunt, I can see the kind of the centrist sort of rallying position, and she holds the sword well. But really, there's nobody around, whatever they've got left, however many hundred MPs it is, 300 odd. There's nobody really there where 80% of the party is going to rally around, and everything they do, you're just going to say, right, now we're in government now for a few more months. Vote for everything I say, and don't be talking to the media. It's just not going to happen. That candidate does not exist, even if they'd only changed leader once. Never mind having changed 3 times.
And let me just turn to Keir Starmer and the Labour Party then, because we're having this conversation almost as if they are a shoo-in for government. And again, we discussed, Kevin, the many pitfalls that Labour oppositions in the past have faced when they seemed able to go on and win a general election. And of course, they've fallen at the final furlong off in 1992, probably the most recent and perhaps the most famous, when Neil Kinnock was expected to beat John Major, and John Major got his soapbox out and Neil Kinnock got his rock star outfit on for a Sheffield rally, and the rest is history, so to speak. But Rishi Sunak, as I say, had his own sort of double whammy of the by-election defeats. In a sense, Keir Starmer had a double whammy of his own, didn't he, over the past couple of weeks, because he ditched his £28 billion pledge for the economic growth plan, which was investment in green energy and sustainable energy. And then, of course, he's had this horrible time at the Rochdale by-election and actually, has lost not one parliamentary candidate, but two, because just to remind listeners, there was a tape recording of a meeting that took place back in October in Hyndburn, where the Rochdale Labour candidate, Azhar Ali, was in attendance and made some very unfortunate remarks about Israel. And then Graham Jones, who was set to be Labour's parliamentary candidate in Hyndburn, said some pretty distasteful things about Israel as well. So both of those people have been suspended from the Labour Party. But the Middle East generally is a bit of a thorn in Starmer's side. The SNP are poking the bear as far as that's concerned. I think they're going to put another motion down in Westminster this week, calling for a ceasefire. So Starmer's not home and dry, not home and host, as they'd say. He's still got these local difficulties to deal with. But again, good question to put to you, really, Kevin. Is this just something that the Westminster bubble and people like us take notice of, and people outside in the ether who are more worried about the mortgages, the cost of living, and just time for a change sort of resonates most? Are they even paying any attention to this stuff that Starmer's having to deal with?
Well, I don't know. I think the main, I'd say two things really about Starmer. One is he's not signed the deal yet. And as we just talked about, for all of the Tories' problems, they know how to win elections, and they've got a good political strategist who's already in running the election campaign for them, Levido. So you can never discount them, as you said about 92 and other instances. And Starmer hasn't got that Blair thing, that we'll be familiar with. And of course, opinions about Blair now are different for many people than they were in the lead up to 97. But he looked like the man, didn't he? He had the charisma, he had this ability. I think people forget just what a great political communicator he was, and just how he was able to find the sort of sweet spot of the nation and appeal to a large number of them. Not all, of course, but to appeal to a large number of them. Starmer doesn't seem to have that, although if you read the Times pieces and Sunday Times pieces over the weekend, you get to see a bit more of the real man who seems to be. He does seem the kind of guy you'd want to go for a pint with, but he hasn't yet got that across. And the second thing is, you touch on it with £28 billion green economic growth plan. Where's the policies? You kind of knew what Labour was about in the run up to 97. You kind of knew it, and you can have a sort of rose-tinted view of in the lead up to 97 looking back. They didn't have amazing policies out there. They were committed to the first 2 years of spending to be the same as the Tories had in place, Ken Clarke had in place. But they had some basic things about number of kids in the classroom, about cutting waiting lists and so on. And he doesn't yet have those sort of retail policies which are handy and which people understand one or two of them. And of course, he's just chuck one up against the wall a little bit. So I think he's still got work to do. And I'm sure the hope would be that in the course of the next few weeks, but probably months, that one or two other, symbolic policies become to resonate, to stand for Labour and that resonate with the public at large. Whether the issues in Gaza and what happens on Wednesday with the SNP vote, whether it has much consequence on people, I don't know. But of course, he's got this, it's a tricky enough situation already, but of course, he's come in on the back tail of Corbyn, trying to make sure that Labour is not seen to be anti-Semitic. And so everything he sort of does has got to be through that lens of making sure that stain is removed. And obviously the last couple of weeks have not been helpful in that. But I think it's about sealing the deal with the electorate, which he's far from doing, I think. And secondly, about Labour, and I'd say this both nationally and regionally, which we'll come on to, having some policies that people can get their heads around, and not just the likes of us who are doing this podcast today.
Yeah, and I think the other thing I'd say in terms of the Gaza situation, I would totally agree with you that most voters don't take much notice of what Starmer, Sunak, or anybody else in UK politics is saying about that particular situation, although everybody who watches the pictures on the BBC and other news channels will be horrified at the absolutely appalling scenes that we're seeing now in that part of the world. But of course, Labour does have, generally speaking, big support within the Muslim community of the UK. And that's where many of his MPs, one of your MPs indeed, in Birmingham, Kevin, will be getting a little concerned. And there's independent candidates now going to stand on that single issue, where streeting is going to be opposed, for example, in his constituency. And then, of course, you've got the spectre of George Galloway. So, you've got Rishi Sunak worried about Nigel Farage, and Starmer will be concerned about Galloway getting back into Parliament and using that as a pulpit to just continually talk about the Middle East conflict and wind up the left of Starmer's party and those Muslim voters who ordinarily will fall into that sort of Labour supporting category. And Jim, I suppose that's where he will have concerns, and is why I'm reading this morning that he is likely to actually do some sort of compromise deal with the SNP and maybe even support their motion this week.
Yes, David Lammy, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, was on yesterday and echoing what Starmer said in his Scottish conference speech about stop the fighting. Starmer kept on saying stop the fighting. He hasn't quite moved on to this permanent ceasefire line. I mean, just to spell it out for people, the objection to a complete ceasefire without conditions is that they would just allow Hamas to regroup and start firing their rockets back into Israel. And the Labour Party at the moment is not prepared to call for a complete and permanent ceasefire for that reason. But Starmer's rhetoric has definitely moved towards them. Just one or two other points on this. I'm quite intrigued as to how the Mail on Sunday got the Azhar Ali story in the first place. It's been suggested that sort of disaffected Corbynites trying to embarrass Starmer might have been the source. And you do wonder whether they have further footage out there ready to drop in at inconvenient moments. I just leave the thought there. I am sure the Labour Party are doing as thorough as possible vetting of all their candidates at the moment to try and check out on this. I mean, to be fair to Starmer's people, they have said this: the Lancashire meeting was not actually a Labour organised meeting, and how can we be everywhere? And that one has to be fair to them on that front. But just as we've said that reform can act as a sort of gravity drag against the Conservatives, in some seats, these independent candidates, the Gaza candidates, if you want to put it like that, in certain key seats, particularly in the West Midlands, will have a noticeable effect. We cannot underestimate Muslim friends that I talk to. They are very, very bitter about the Labour Party's stance on this. And whilst in the broad context, it's still definitely the economy. I just think in some key seats, it could make a difference. And the final point about, any confidence in the Labour government, let's just remind ourselves every week, Keir Starmer needs a bigger swing than Tony Blair got in 1997 to get a one-seat majority. Now, while we obviously are distracted by the huge swings in Loughborough in Wellingborough this week, we do need to bear that in mind, the context of this.
Well, the swing in Wellingborough would actually, if translated across the country, leave the Conservatives with 4 seats. I don't think anybody's quite expecting that. But I think there's 2 points I'd make about your comments, Jim. I think firstly, we often look in the past, we say history will teach us about the future, and often that is the case. But what I would say is that in 1997, we didn't have as transient a voter as we have in 2024. People's loyalties to the tribe are long gone. And that's why we're seeing these big swings from one party to another, and poll leads changing, and people being persuaded to go for a particular candidate at a particular time. You just don't have that same gut instinct of, well, I'm voting Labour or I'm voting Conservative because my mum, my granddad, my grandma did. That just doesn't happen anymore. And then the very final point that you made, the economy stupid. And the thing I've not mentioned yet, in terms of all the trials and tribulations that Sunak has had, we went into officially recession last week. And that is the thing, Kevin, I think is going to kill Sunak and kill the Tories, because people are looking at the economy and saying it's not getting any better. And I even heard, and it wasn't a politician, it was a voter on a Vox Pop, said, well, I keep hearing that we're going to go back to square one with Labour. Well, square one's better than where we are. And I think an awful lot of people in the country are looking for that change, that fresh start, which is why I now think Starmer will be Prime Minister whenever that general election takes place.
I do not understand why Sunak is rolling out that line, particularly at PMQs every week, back to square one, because the obvious retort to that is, we'll take square one. Thanks very much. Over all this nonsense. We'll go back to 2010 or we'll go back to 97 or whatever other point. If the Tories can't deliver low interest rates, low inflation, if they can't reduce your taxes, if they can't grow the economy, what are they for? And on all of those measures, the Tories have not delivered. Now, of course, they will get into the pandemic, into the energy crisis in Ukraine and so on. And of course, there are mitigating factors for many of them. But of course, they have made too many errors themselves, be that back to austerity politics and the lack of investment in infrastructure and public services and public service reform, or back to the quasi-Kwarteng budget and all the rest of it and the policies that are followed. And all that Sunak can hang on to at the moment is inflation having halved. And we all know that's not down to him, that's down to the Bank of England and to sort of global economic forces. So if the Tories can't deliver on the economy, what are they for? And that's probably one reason why the Tories are in such a mess over other things, immigration, Rwanda, etc., because they're not able to deliver on their sort of central reason for being. And they've got a pretty poor track record over the last few years on those absolutely key criteria. So I think that is absolutely right what you say, Frank. But I go back to my view that, Keir hasn't quite sealed the deal, as the phrase has it, not least because of trying to get across his own sort of personality and vision. Not enough yet anyway. And you've got to vote for something. Yes, hopefully you vote for change and hope. They're going to be big factors. But I think people are also going to need some policies to get their heads round and to rally round when they get to the ballot box. And of course, you referenced 92. That was the problem, wasn't it? Sheffield had an impact on all of that. But really, what a lot of the evidence says is that, we're not very happy with those Tories and all the stuff that's gone on, poll tax and all the rest of it. But when they got to the ballot box, they couldn't quite put their cross against Labour. Now, for the reasons you touched on, sort of family loyalties and so on, that's dissipated even more. But you do need things to vote for. And I don't think yet people have got enough things to vote for Labour on.
And West Streeting is...
Sorry, Jim. I think that's one of the frustrations Starmer will have at the moment, though, in terms of these emerging internal wrangles once again, because his 3-point plan, in a sense, included, let's sort out the party. Let's get rid of the lunatics, as he will put it, and I will put it as well. And let's have a new look party that we can go to the country with confidence and say, look, we have changed. And of course, he's being dragged back into that internal politics situation again, rather than being able perhaps to spend the time that he wants to spend on developing arguments about policy and what a Labour government would mean. Sorry, Jim, I interrupted you there.
No, I just wanted to say that, West Streeting's a good friend of Downtown and does a lot of events for us, and we mustn't be guilty every week of pumping him up. But we were saying that there's no obvious successor to Rishi Sunak as Prime Minister. I would submit that there is a potential new leader of the Labour Party in West Streeting. I say that for two reasons. One, he is more relaxed with the voters and comes over better on television than Keir Starmer. But the other thing is what Kevin was briefly mentioning there, public service reform. Streeting has had the guts to say that the NHS is not a shrine, it's a service, and it's got to be reformed. And it's a bit detailed and nerdy, and Kevin's better on the presentation of things than me, and it might not work. But, people are have a perception that lots of our public services aren't working properly and they need to be reformed. And the fear is that Labour will be a bit soft on that because of their union support, and that they won't be any more effective at getting to the roots of the problems of the delivery of public services that actually needs to be done. There does need to be fundamental reform, but it's behind the scenes sort of work that needs to be done, and whether it can be projected into a key policy that Starmer absolutely needs. But Streeting's onto something there, and with his personality, he's going to challenge Keir in terms of the style of how Labour is led when they're in government, because there will be as I've said before. You can just see 6 months in a beleaguered Rachel Reeves with all sorts of people saying, well, nothing's changed. People are impatient now. Nothing's changed. We're sticking to cuts. Nothing's improved. And you can see that sort of grinding in. And Kevin's absolutely right. They need to identify one or two policies. Whether public service reform is one of them, I just don't know how it could be presented. But that's my thought on it.
Yeah, and I think Bridget Phillipson had put a good argument up as well to say that in terms of education, she's again laying out some quite innovative and exciting plans, and again, mostly around public sector reform. And listen, unions have been more of a problem for this Conservative government than they certainly were for the last Labour one. So will people buy? Again, you two in particular, will remember the 70s well. I, of course, struggle a little, but, most voters don't, Jim. And so, again, I do think that trying to hold the unions up as some sort of, bogey group of organisations that are going to kill a Labour government. Labour just needs to say, well, we've never had more disputes since the 70s, since this particular Parliament. So I'm not quite sure that's going to work. The final point I'm going to make. You
think public service unions are going to embrace the sort of reforms that Wes Streeting is floating? Because it will mean a change for them.
Maybe not, Jim, but I think what will happen is they're going to have to. They are going to have to work in partnership with Labour. Otherwise, then it will quickly all fall apart, because Labour is going to inherit an absolute mess. And actually, what the Conservatives are setting up, if we're to believe what's going to happen at the budget, is an even bigger mess, because, and that's the point I just wanted to go into. Let me just ask Kevin about
can I just say,
no,
just my final point is to try and get the unions to operate a 7-day train service. That's what is behind a lot of these strikes, and it doesn't get a lot of publicity. They will not accept that they are a 7-day service, that they want to retain the right to volunteer to work on Sundays. And so that's the mentality, that I'm referring to.
Yeah, but that's not anything to do with schools or hospitals last time I looked, Jim. So shut the fuck up. Kevin, are we to believe this sort of narrative that's starting to emerge in terms of the March the 6th budget and Geoffrey Hunt's 2p tax cut that we can all look forward to? And if so, how would you advise Labour to handle that?
Well, and there seems to be some doubt in the last few days it is going to get a 2p cut away, given where the sort of debt situation, the growth situation both are. And it could be, if he's trailed. I've never heard a chancellor and a governing party trail as much around a budget and basically telling you we're going to bring you more tax cuts in the budget, which is a platform for the next election. If he doesn't then deliver on that, I mean, that's the sort of worst of all worlds. But let's assume he's going to deliver something. Maybe it's a 1p cut. Maybe he'll switch it more to national insurance, etc. Rachel Reeves is her problem is that she's going to stick to the fiscal limit. She's going to stick to the spending plans, the overall spending envelope of the Tories. I think for the first 2 years, the same way as Labour Brown did back in the run up to 97. Of course, what we all know is, and I think even what the public knows, is that really means reductions in public spending. And given all the problems we have, NHS, of course, but in whether it's trains, whether it's schools, any part of the sort of public sphere is in some form of crisis. Prisons, you name it. Social care, we know very long-term problems there that nobody's really tackling. everybody knows that public services need more money. They also need a lot of reform. I'm with Jim on that. And I think the bigger problem for Rachel Reeves is not how she handles the tax cut, because who's going to say, I'm not going to give you the tax cut? Her broader problem is, how do you make the sums add up and make sure that you've got the kind of spending needed to do something to shift the dial on public services, even if, and touching on Jim's point, even if you say to people, look, bear with us for 2 years, we've got to try and sort out the mess. We'll do a few quick fixes here and there, but the bigger prizes are going to be 2 years and more beyond. That's going to be quite tricky, I think. I'd be more worried about what she's going to do about dealing with the spending total than actually dealing with the sort of the presentational aspects of whether you agree with the tax cut or not.
Do you think he'll do the tax cut thing, Jim?
Well, it's been a hokey-cokey, hasn't it? I mean, Kevin's quite right. There's not only been an extraordinary amount of trailing of this budget, but it's been inconsistent. I mean, I don't think I'm wrong here. We began by, yes, there's going to be tax cuts in the budget. Then, after some ONS figures came out, he did another interview saying there won't be. And now we're back to there will be tax cuts again. So we'll just have to wait and see. But I'm intrigued, excuse me, that what will Labour do? I mean, I think Kevin hinted that Rachel would have no alternative but to match, say, a 2p cut in income tax. Really? I mean, that is stretching the credibility. I mean, stretching the patience of most Labour voters, and certainly on the left of the party. But I mean, I can understand that they want to, stick to the current plans. But I think a 2p cut in income tax would set a huge challenge for Rachel Reeves. But maybe Kevin's right.
Well, I think, and the bigger problem is you can't keep saying that non-dom status and VAT and private schools are going to deliver you the extra money you need to sort of fill in the gaps. I mean, that is kind of running to the end of its credibility if it hasn't already been passed. So they've got to find other way. They don't want to go with a wealth tax. They don't want to go with bigger tax rates at the upper echelons. So they need to find other sources of income. I think they're right to say that you go after sort of fraudulent spending from the pandemic and so on, that you go after trying to close some tax loopholes, that you try and spend more time recovering tax from very wealthy people who have used various techniques rather than worrying about, welfare claimants who've claimed £5 more than they should have done here and there. But all of that still doesn't really add up, does it? And that's
no. But what about actually saying no? Okay, the Chancellor, and I know this is bold, and I think Frank will come back on me. No, Chancellor, you've cut income tax by 2p. You have now created the red water or the blue water between us. We are not going down that route. And taking your point, the British people are not fools. They know the public services are on their knees. Labour is going to stand up for reversing that 2p income tax cut. Suicidal politics, Frank, or something that would appeal to the honesty of the electorate?
What they will be fearful of taking that sort of approach would be the 92 double whammy tax bombshell. Labour will say one thing, they haven't really changed. And sadly, and it is sad this, but politicians these days don't seem to be as bound by political manifestos as they once were. We were promised levelling up, we were promised HS2, we were promised that national insurance contributions would not be increased in this parliament. All of those have been turned around by successive Conservative prime ministers. My guess is that Rachel Reeves will say we are going to go along with the tax cut because we've been taxed more than we should have been over the past 10, 14 years, whichever measure she chooses to take. And Labour's plan, say, I guess, will be to actually borrow more money and to try and do something around interest rates that give them a little bit of headroom to do that within the first couple of years. And then an awful lot of the other stuff, as Kevin said, is going to be a bit of fluff and a bit of marketing collateral, I suppose. I was reading at the weekend that the HMRC have now sort of cut back by up to 50% in terms of taking investigations forward against those people who are quite literally evading tax, but at big numbers, whilst, as again Kevin's alluded to, people who are seem to be fiddling the benefits, either a week or something, are being hard hit. So I think there is a story for Labour to tell there, and I don't think that Rachel Reeves is the sort of character who's going to go against the tax cuts for all the reasons that we've said, in terms of the history, in terms of the narrative that she's been sort of alluded to throughout the last couple of years of her shadow chancellorship. I just can't see her not accepting tax cuts if that's what happens. The thing that might stop Hunt, of course, is he might be fearful of the market's reaction, not Rachel Reeves's reaction, because the IMF have said there's no room for tax cuts. We've gone into recession now. There's other commentators saying it'd be absolute madness. And what Hunt was supposed to do was come in and offer some stability and some grown-up approach to the economy. So a tax cut might backfire on him.
Yeah, but I think.
Listen, I'm going to close the conversation, Jim, sorry, because I know Kevin's got to leave us in about 10 minutes or so, and I'm keen to get his thoughts on a very important mayoral election, possibly the most interesting that's going to happen in May, and that's in the West Midlands, where Andy Street is the incumbent. And be back in a moment to have a chat about that mayoral poll. On April the 18th, 2024, Downtown in Business will be hosting our Changemakers Live conference. It's an absolutely fantastic event with an eclectic range of speakers looking at everything: innovation, science, tech, health, sport, whole range of topics that we'll be talking about this year. So as I say, April the 18th, it's at the Spine Building in Liverpool. Book your tickets now. Go to our website, all the W's, downtowninbusiness.com, and register for your ticket today. Welcome back to the second part of this week's Downtown Den Politics podcast, where I'm joined by not just Jim Hancock, our political commentator, but by Kevin Johnson, our good friend in Birmingham, who is the managing director of Urban Comms, a public affairs, public relations agency. And Kevin, you have got a very interesting mayoral election in your neck of the woods. West Midlands, Andy Street, the incumbent. He's won the thing twice against the odds, I think it's fair to say, on both occasions. What is the mood at this moment in time?
Well, I think it's early days, isn't it? I don't really feel as if it's broken out yet. Of course, both main candidates, Andy Street for the Conservatives, as you say, Richard Parker for Labour. Of course, they're out campaigning, launching campaigns, volunteers on, banging doors and leafleting and all the rest of it. But it hasn't really sort of broken through, I don't think, into the mainstream beyond nerds like ourselves. As you say, Andy Street won, if you like, against the odds. On any sort of normal political landscape, the West Midlands should be Labour, broadly speaking, and it's not been. Andy Street has sort of used the power of his own status, a sort of independent businessman, a Tory, yes, for many years, but somebody who wears it pretty lightly, so lightly that most of his campaign literature is green rather than blue. And he's spoken out a few times, maybe not as many times as he might have done, but he's spoken out a few times against his own party, of course, not least on HS2 most recently. I would say that in the past he's been up against Sean Simon, who did not perform at the ballot box as well as many of us would have anticipated, and didn't perform in the campaign as we would have anticipated. Liam Byrne was the candidate last time around, a very, very intelligent and good political operator, but didn't really run a campaign which cut through to the electorate, and Andy Street's legacy won through. This time, I think it's different. Now, there is a candidate that most people will have not heard of, but has been involved in and around the scene for a long time. Richard Parker used to work at PwC. He was involved in the back room of both of those previous campaigns for Sean and for Liam. He doesn't have profile, which I think is going to be his major challenge. But I think in terms of his political thinking, I think in terms of his approach to the job, I think in terms of getting the volunteer base out onto the streets campaigning for him, I think he'll be better at that. And of course, Andy Street's problems wearing, however lightly, a Conservative badge will probably be more problematic for him this time than it was the last two times round. I suppose Andy Street will be pointing to
some quite significant investments and successes that he'd say he was at least partly responsible for. So, some big infrastructure spend actually in and around the West Midlands. Also the Commonwealth Games, which he, of course, took full advantage of in terms of his profile, and why not? That's what elected mayors are supposed to do. And he is a good champion for the region, to the point that you make the point there yourself, Kevin, that he doesn't wear that Conservative Party badge with particular enthusiasm at times, and has a great relationship, for example, with Andy Burnham in Manchester, and they're starting to have conversations about trying to re-establish that Birmingham to Manchester HS2 link, for example. He's seen as a doer, isn't he? Somebody who can deliver. And then I guess the other thing he'll be pointing to is Birmingham City Council and its financial travails, because Labour-run authority, he'll be saying, look, that's what you could have if you elect a Labour mayor here.
Yes, I mean, and you say, of course, he claims political advantage from things like the Commonwealth Games. He really does claim political advantage from just about everything he possibly can. And I do think that if I was anywhere near running the Labour campaign, that will be one of the things I'd be targeting, is his propensity to wear a hard hat and a high-vis jacket at the drop of another hat is pretty legendary. And I think, and he does work incredibly hard, and he's well across his briefs. You and I know that, Frank. But I think that that look of being this man who is across social media and always sort of getting in the photos, that may work against him if Labour run a campaign effectively on that score. I think the Richard Parker Labour approach will be to be a little bit more collegiate than Andy Street has at times been. It's a very difficult region, both in terms of the sort of regional geography of it. Bringing together Wolverhampton, Birmingham, Coventry and all parts in between is very difficult. And of course, we've got, unlike, say, in Greater Manchester, we've got political differences. Different colours run different parts of the region in terms of councils. That's difficult to pull together and has been problematic at times for Andy, which Richard might take a different approach to that. So he's got that in his locker, I think, Richard, if he plays it right. Andy Street is the man who backed Boris. I remember, because I asked him a question at an event about 3 days before the Pincher scandal broke, and he was still enthusiastically backing Boris as the only man who could deliver levelling up. And he was the man who backed Liz Truss, rather oddly. So, he's made some odd political choices in his time as well. I think sometimes he lacks a political antennae in the way that some other politicians do. So I think it's more challenging. But of course, he's got a good legacy, and I don't think anybody would doubt he's been a good ambassador, a good champion for the West Midlands, where probably that was one of the West Midlands' greatest problems, is we didn't have people to national government or on international stages who were representing and promoting the region. And he's done, whatever you think of the politics, he's done that incredibly well. And that will be a challenge if he is succeeded by somebody else. That will be a challenge for them.
Could I ask Kevin? Could I just ask you, Kevin? Has Richard Parker been a councillor or a parliamentary candidate at all before now? Is this his first sort of test of
first foray, yes, into it? I think was he not his sort of natural part of his career path to go and do this, but has been involved. You talked about Rachel Reeves, Jim. He's very close to Rachel Reeves, been sort of an advisor informally to her. He was involved in putting together the first West Midlands Combined Authority deal, which was a hell of a deal to put together along with the politicians. He from his PwC standpoint, helped to stitch that together and has done other work on it since. And he's been involved not as campaign manager, but has been involved in the previous two campaigns, and as I know has been involved in many by-elections, etc. since campaigning for Labour. He's Labour through and through. I do think, though, that the problem is you've got two, pretty grey, if I could put it that way, middle-aged men, white middle-aged men fighting out for the vote in the West Midlands. If you're coming to this absolutely cold, you probably wouldn't be able to work out what the difference is between the two. You probably wouldn't be able to work out which party both are in, because you could probably switch the parties around for them in on certain areas. So I think that, distinguishing yourself is going to be difficult, and probably even harder for Richard because he's got pretty low levels of awareness. And even Andy Street, for all his success, and as I said about being a champion and an ambassador, as we all know, not that many people know their council leader or even their regional mayor. There's still a way to go for that. And as well as the sort of conservative brand issue that Andy will have, even though he wears it lightly, the big issue is going to be turnout, isn't it?
Yeah, and there's no local elections in Birmingham this year, is there? So will that be a help or a hindrance to Andy Street?
I think that will probably be a help because the natural Birmingham vote would be more to come out towards Labour. Although, as you talked about earlier, Frank, of course, with the issues that Birmingham City Council has had, and with the Gaza issues, and with a big Muslim community in Birmingham, the normal vote patterns may not apply in Birmingham anyway, with or without council elections going on. So there's quite a few variables in there, and people are not necessarily going to vote for a mayor because they think he's going to fix the trains. They may have other reasons. They're entitled to choose their mayor for whatever reason they have. And I think, again, from a Rishi Sunak, sorry to go back to his point, if you're Rishi Sunak, you should be thinking about that, because if you went on the same day, then I think more people would be likely to vote for the mayor that they want, or the party to be the mayor that they want. If you're going on a different day and you're shoving the election to October and November, of course, it's going to be used as a protest vote for many, isn't it? And that is not going to be helpful to Andy Street.
Yeah, it's a great point, actually. It's interesting also what you say, Kevin, about people not necessarily recognising Andy Street, the electorate within the West Midlands, because I would suggest that outside of Andy Burnham, he's probably the best known regional mayor. He's the one who you do see quoted in the national press, most famously in terms of the HS2 row, but other times as well, and profile during the Commonwealth Games, of course. Then lots of profile stuff around the fact that he's gone from business into politics. He was chief executive of John Lewis. So he does have a high profile, but you don't think that necessarily translates into what local voters will know?
Well, he does have a relatively high profile, but I'd underline the word relatively. Amongst sort of local politicians, amongst people, and indeed amongst people outside of Westminster, yes, he's relatively well known, but still probably not enough that's going to do all that you need it to do for you at the ballot box. We know, don't we, that you and I might be, and Jim may be familiar, and many of our listeners may be familiar with individual MPs, council leaders, mayors, etc. But still, there is a pretty low awareness of elected officials overall, and people often will get them confused, and they'll certainly get their parties confused, and that's probably even more the case with Andy Street than anybody else because of him wearing his rosette so lightly.
Final point I'll make on this, Kevin, that if Andy's, well, two things I'll ask actually, but if Andy Street did win, and we ended up with a Starmer government, would that make his life more difficult, do you think? Because, of course, he has had, during his period in office, the same party in government. He's been able to pick the phone up to, I think it was Theresa May, wasn't it, back in the day, and then to Johnson, and then to Liz Truss for a couple of days, and then obviously to Rishi Sunak. How do you think he'd get on with a Labour government?
Well, people will talk about this forever. And of course, probably naturally it's easier if you're the mayor in a region. It's probably easier to pick up the phone and to the Prime Minister, to a Chancellor of the same colour. However, Burnham has had his moments, but he's gone on pretty well, hasn't he, I think, with governments to a large extent. I mean, with some famous discrepancies, of course, and not least during the pandemic. But he can get on with other people. And I think if you know Street, as you and I do, Frank, and if you know Sunak from what we can tell, and you know Starmer from what we can tell, they're pretty, for all the chat we've had earlier, they're pretty sort of reasonable and decent people. And I think a Starmer is not going to, not let the West Midlands have something because the wrong man, the wrong person of the wrong political colour is in office in the West Midlands. I think they would. I mean, and frankly, their real political differences are not much. You would argue there is people, as we've said right at the top of this podcast, there's people in the Tory party who have bigger political differences than there are political differences, I would suggest, between, say, a Starmer and a Street.
And if you were a betting man, Kevin, and was holding the gun to your head and said, right, you've got to put your money on one or t'other, who are you going for?
It really, I'll answer, but it really does depend if there's going to be another election on the 2nd of May. If there is not another election on the 2nd of May, and if Parker can, get out there and get some awareness and get some policies out there, I think he could do it. It'll be very, very difficult. But if he can get the vote out, and if he can get some kind of awareness, he won't be able to challenge Street on sort of awareness levels, but get some kind of awareness from pretty much a zero base, he's got a chance of doing it, I think.
Interesting. And James, elsewhere, where are the places that we need to be looking out for in terms of the local elections? Are there any towns, cities that are going to swing one way or the other? I think you made the point recently, actually. Very difficult for Labour to make gains because in the corresponding elections 4 years ago, Labour did really well.
Yes, and over the years, I mean, that's the normal pattern. When a party goes out of office, it starts to make gains in local government. And broadly speaking, with some hiccups, Labour have been making gains, initially, of course, at the collapse of the Liberal Democrats in the coalition years, but successively grinding out situations where you've almost got a complete, as Kevin was saying, in Greater Manchester, a complete lockout for Labour, apart from Stockport, of course, where the Liberal Democrats continue to be influential. There are one or two other contests around the region. Merseyside's rock solid for Labour, but there will be some level of interest in the local elections, I think, but it'll largely be a dress rehearsal for the general election. But I hear what Kevin says, about May the 2nd for a general election. I'm not a rip off the sticking plaster thing myself. I just think the instincts of, if this is all I've got in office, I'm going to hang on. I mean, it was even speculation of the January 25 nightmare. Here's your Christmas present, and by the way, you're voting in a few weeks' time. I'm certainly not a believer in that. I think that would show absolute desperation, and it would just be a farce because everybody would know the date of the general election because of the constitutional deadline. But I mean, just one other mayoral election, of course, is Ben Houchin, who's not as well recognised as Andy Street, but in the Teesside area.
He is by private eye.
Yeah, and of course he's robustly fought off all these accusations about corruption in relation to the Redcar Steelworks site, and he comes over quite well. But obviously, as Kevin says, these mayors are, however good they are locally, they are facing national political tides. And if we had more time, we could rehearse some good people who are swept out in favour. I'm not saying Richard Parker's not a good person, but they're swept out. I think people generally thought Shirley Williams was a great MP for Crosby, but she was swept out on a political tide, and this can happen. So, there'll be a lot of interest in the West Midlands. I find it absolutely fascinating. It's a very, very important part of the country, and of course with so many marginal seats as well. Always a big battleground, and we'll see how Richard Parker does. But I don't know anything about him. I shall take a lot more interest in him now, following Kevin's excellent briefing on who he is.
Yeah, Newcastle are electing its first elected mayor as well, regional mayor. So that'll be an interesting one because there's the former Labour mayor for the city of Newcastle. I think I might have this terribly wrong because I'm not as au fait with the local government structures in the North East as I ought to be. But I think Labour have got a challenge there from a former Labour candidate. So that might sort of throw something into the mix. But I think Labour will take that. It's a really excellent female candidate, actually, called Claire McGuinness. So she's expected to become the mayor of Newcastle and the wider region, the North East. So that could be interesting, that part of the world, actually, couldn't it? Because, again, Kevin referenced very briefly the excellent article that was in the Sunday Times, which is sort of previewing the book that's out on Starmer. And apparently he was close to resigning after the by-election defeat in Hartlepool. again in the northeast, you see. And so, that part of the world, whereas at one time would have just been seen as shooing for Labour, contested quite hard these days. So it will be an interesting result that comes out about Teesside and as I say, Newcastle as well. Anything else, Kevin, that we should be looking out for in terms of the West Midlands outside of that mayoral poll?
Well, you referenced, didn't you, the travails of Birmingham City Council. More on that with a budget today. I think that is a sore that is going to be there for some time. I think, and it does it. For all there are very, very credible arguments about the funding of local government, which, as Jim just said, if we had more time, we should be talking about the challenge of local government funding and that needing drastic reform, not just in finance but also in our attitude towards local government and the role it plays in our lives. So that is going to be a stain, I think, to some degree. Of course, it's the biggest one, but of course there are many other local authorities which are struggling. They've either declared or they're struggling with finance and on the edge of declaring bankruptcy. That is an issue that should come to the fore in the general election campaign in terms of because what do we care about? We care about bins, our roads, and social care, don't we? More than perhaps some people might care about Gaza or whatever else. And these things are in the hands of local government and they get scant attention.
Great point. A good one to end this week's Downtown Den Politics podcast on. Thank you very much for joining us, Kevin, and for your insights into the West Midlands in particular. Jim, as ever, good to see you as well. And listen, we'll be back next week. God knows what's going to happen over the next 7 days. We've got that vote on Gaza. We'll have no doubt more trailing of the budget, which happens on the 6th of March. And of course, a week on Thursday, we have that Rochdale by-election. Will it be Galloway? Will it be Azhar Ali? Or will it indeed be Simon Danchuk? Some very interesting articles about him and his past over the weekend as well. But given the fact that Simon and I get on quite well, despite his politics these days, I'll not say any more. Been great talking to you again. Hope you've enjoyed this episode. We'll be back in the Downtown Den next week.
Goodbye.